Hey guys, Drew Rice here, and welcome to the Engineering Success YouTube channel, where each week I talk about different personal finance and career related topics. This week, I wanted to talk to you guys about the racial wealth gap and why it matters. This video took me a while to write and to make because it's a very important topic, and I want to make sure I did this topic justice. My goal with this channel has always been to open a dialogue that we as young people can use to better ourselves financially, because I think that those topics are not discussed enough in our everyday life, and they really make the difference in how much freedom we're able to enjoy later on in our lives if we're able to plan ahead. And recently, there's been a lot going on with regard to race relations and the justice system in the United States, with the recent murders of Ahmaud Arbery, George Floyd, and Breonna Taylor, just to name a few. And in today's video, I wanted to discuss what seems to be the cause of this racial disparity in the justice system. And that seems to me to be this wealth inequality issue that we currently have. Now, whether you agree with that initial statement, I want you to listen to the rest of the video and hear me out. So to get you guys on the same page, I want to start by looking at the racial wealth gap. And specifically, what we're going to be looking at are median net worth values by race. And the reason we're going to be looking at net worth as opposed to income, while there is an income gap between races as well, net worth is a much better measure of wealth because it shows what a person's total accrued assets, whether that be cash, real estate, retirement accounts, minus their liabilities. So it gives us a very good picture of how much capital that person has available to them. And then the reason we're looking at the median net worth as opposed to the mean or the average most people are used to is because the median does a much better job of giving us a true middle. And that way our numbers aren't getting skewed higher by outliers like Jeff Bezos, Bill Gates, Warren Buffett, people like that are not representative of the average American. So the median is going to be giving us the exact middle net worth of each of these racial groups, which should give us a much more accurate representation of what it is like for the average person. Okay, so I'm going to put a chart up now, and as you can see, as of 2016, white Americans have an average net worth of about $171,000, while black families have a net worth of about 1/10 that at 17.15. Now, when we see such a stark disparity like that, we have to ask ourselves why. What could be the cause of this 10x gap? Why are black Americans so far behind when it comes to building wealth? I think it's important to know that the most highly valued asset that most people own is their home, i.e. real estate. And when we consider the impact of the racial discrimination that prevented black people from being able to own property for basically the first half of American history, and then once black Americans were actually allowed to own land, there were practices where certain neighborhoods were redlined, meaning they were marked as a red neighborhood, and therefore only minorities were allowed to live in that area. And the green neighborhoods that were not redlined, that were supposed to be the white neighborhoods, often people in the real estate community wouldn't even show those properties to minorities, and banks would deny loans for those areas, only approving loans in these redline neighborhoods. What this ended up causing was a massive disparity because you get these white neighborhoods that have more funding, they get more businesses that build in those areas, which increases the property values. And meanwhile, these redline neighborhoods aren't able to increase at the same value, and it's harder for people to get those loans because not only was it a real estate issue, it was also a banking issue. Banks were much less likely to offer home loans to black Americans than they were white Americans, even with equal credit scores and equal incomes. This is a glaring problem with causing wealth disparity because even poor white people still had much greater access to getting home loans from banks and being able to buy in non-redline neighborhoods. And what this meant was that even those poor white people were able to start investing and building their wealth in real estate, which was just by virtue of them being white. And this is a huge advantage because when you consider how real estate is able to appreciate over time, it meant that a person that was able to pay just a little bit more than their rent for a very modest home mortgage because they had access to a loan, they were able to be putting that money into an asset that would appreciate over time. Meanwhile, a minority that was not allowed access to those loans may have been paying rent still and then just saving money to try and get to the point where they could afford a better home or not have to have as much of a loan. And all the while, inflation is eating away at those cash storages, making them decrease in value while they sit. Meanwhile, the home that the poor white person has bought is appreciating in value. meaning that they are growing wealth over time. As a quick example, if you want to contextualize this in today's dollars, a median home price in the United States is about $245,000 for the entire US. And if you are a poor person who is able to gain access to home loans and you buy an $100,000 home today with an average appreciation of 4% per year, and on average, real estate appreciates between 3 and 5%. So at a 4% appreciation rate, only a $100,000 home, and you leave that to your children 50 years from now, right? That home will be worth over $700,000. And here's the real beauty of it. Because you leave it to your kids and it's below the estate tax limit, then what that means is that if those children go to sell that home, they will sell that home, and let's say they sell that home a couple years later for $800,000. They will only pay capital gains on that last $100,000 gain. They won't pay capital gains on the first $600,000 that home appreciated from the time that you bought it. That's a huge advantage when you're looking at building wealth and net worth. So we can easily see how access to real estate can really put you ahead in the long run when it comes to building up wealth generationally. And I think that has a lot to do with that 10x wealth gap that we were discussing earlier. So that's the first point. The second question we want to ask is, what does this have to do with the policing and the justice system? And oftentimes you'll see people on both sides of this issue bring up statistics that they say prove that they know exactly what the cause is and they know why. And one of the main statistics that has been brought up during the past couple of weeks has been the number of people killed by police by race and comparing that to the population ratio, meaning the percentage of that race within the general population, to show that there is a discontinuity between those ratios. And when you look at those numbers, you'll see that Black people make up approximately 40% of those police killings, despite only being 13% of the population. Comparatively, white people make up between 15 and 20% of police killings, while making up 60% of the total population. This inverse relationship brings up a lot of questions and understandably gives people the impression that police are intentionally killing Black people more than they are white people. Now, I think that only presenting this statistic alone is very misleading. And the reason is because I think it's more accurate to compare the police killings versus the arrests of each race in order to have a better understanding of how likely an arrest is to turn violent and then fatal. And that will give us a better idea of how police treat individual suspects based on their race. And when you look at the FBI arrest data, you can see that Black people are arrested at about 2.3 times the rate of white people. And as I pointed out earlier, the amount of Black people killed by police is about 40% and white people is about 20%. So from looking at that, we can see that Black people are both arrested and killed by police at about 2 times the rate of their white counterparts, which means that when you condense the data set down to look at arrests and you want to see, well, how likely is it that a person once arrested is going to end up being killed by a police officer based on their race, they're actually pretty close. They're very, very close to being the same. So from looking at the data, the issue doesn't seem to be that police are intentionally killing Black people at a disproportionate rate once they're arrested. It seems to be the issue of, why is it that Black people are being arrested at twice the rate of white people? And that's the next step that I want to go through. Now, I want to say that I think it's nearly impossible to definitively prove causation on this, but it seems to me the most evidence points to poverty being the leading factor. This is because while some people like to point out that the crime rates for Black Americans are higher than the crime rates for white Americans, they're leaving out other confounding factors. Specifically, when you compare crime rates by race within the same economic position, the numbers are almost identical, which suggests that race is not the driving factor. When we look even deeper, we can see that about 40% of the total violent crimes occur between people below the federal poverty line, or FPL. And 75% of crime is committed between people that are either below the federal poverty line or considered low income, which is at about 200% of the federal poverty line. Now, what that means is that most of the people that are arrested for crimes in the United States are people that are on the poor end of the socioeconomic spectrum. That's something very important to consider here when recognizing in conjunction with the racial wealth gap. Because Black people are twice as likely to be below the federal poverty line compared to their white counterparts. As you can see, they show up 20% of the time, whereas whites show up about 10% of the time. When you consider that regardless of race, the federal poverty line makes up about 11.8% of the US population, we can see that there is a disparity when we are selecting for race. And it doesn't seem to me to be a coincidence that black people are twice as likely to be in poverty, arrested, or killed by police. Now that I've laid this out, I want to address a common argument that is made that suggests that this racial disparity, both in poverty and in crime rates, has to do with the likelihood of being raised in a single-parent household. This is something that has been popularized by certain people in the political sphere in the United States, and I think it's very important to address. Now, while it is true that those who are raised in a single-parent household are more likely to commit crime, it is also true that money is one of the leading causes in parents separating. Additionally, I want you to consider that a greater total number of white children are raised in single-parent households relative to black children. Yet, when you look at the averages, the main difference between children raised by single parents in white households versus black households is the percentage of them that are raised in poverty. Because while there are more white children that are raised in a single parent household, they are less likely to be in poverty, which falls in line with access to economic resources being the driving factor. To further address this, we need to understand that this is a claim that has been made for decades. And we need to consider that if it were true that being raised in a single parent household was the driving force in increased crime rates, we would have to answer, how is it that the percentage of white children raised in single parent households has gone up, yet the wealth gap has only grown farther apart? And when you consider that regardless of race, that single parent households have become more and more common in our modern families, and yet crime rates have been steadily dropping for decades. So it doesn't really make sense that we would have more children raised with single parents and crime rates dropping if it were the case that single parenthood was the factor leading towards increased crime. Now, this video is just covering the tip of the iceberg when it comes to racial and wealth inequality within the United States, but I hope that it has provided a better understanding of the background of what we Americans are dealing with currently and what we still need to deal with in order to have a brighter future for everyone. It seems obvious to me that we need to support and implement policies that are going to help alleviate this wealth gap, hold the justice system accountable, and help to invest in programs that will help lift up poorer areas and decrease crime rates and over-policing in those areas. Now, in the description box for this video, I have sources for the video and links to places where you can donate or help with these causes. I also have some links to some other YouTubers that I think have done a really good job of addressing this problem as well. I think it's very important that we support people speaking out on these very important issues. I also think it's important that people like myself that are YouTube creators and just normal citizens, that we do our part in using our First Amendment rights and speaking out when we see that things are wrong, and to try and actively make our country better. Because at the end of the day, that's what it's all about, is being there for each other and standing up and speaking when you see something that is wrong. As always, thank you guys so much for watching. Let's make sure to do our part in supporting those that are in need of help at this time and always. And just remember, at the end of the day, we need to always be there for one another. Love you all, and see you guys next time.